Welcome to the real Mr. Beer, Mr. Beer's own channel. We are here to provide you with homebrewing guidance and tips, equipping you with all sorts of beer knowledge. My name is Tim Falk. I'm the customer service manager here at Mr. Beer. I'm also the tech support lead for BrewArt US, another one of Cooper's line of products. I have about 3 years of experience brewing with Mr. Beer. I also brew mead, wine, kombucha, and cider. Today we're going to be brewing one of my favorite refills. It's our Bavarian Weissbier Standard Refill. It's got a 4.6 star review on our website, so as you can see it's very popular. It's a real crowd pleaser. It is a 5% ABV beer, just like all of our standard refills. Now that's if you make it with everything that's included with the refill. If you made it with just the can by itself, the ABV would be around 3.5%. It has an SRM of 3. SRM stands for Standard Reference Method. It's a system that modern brewers use to specify color. They determine it by shining a light through about a milliliter of beer, or millimeter rather. Now, we list this beer with an SRM of 3, however, as Josh probably mentioned when he was going over how extract brewing works, beers that are made entirely from extracts have a tendency to turn out a bit darker than intended, especially with your lighter beers such as this. So the SRM of 3 that we list is what's intended for the style. It is possible you'll end up with a beer that's slightly darker, but it'll still taste just as good. This is a great beer for any fan of German wheat beers, generally speaking, Hefeweizens and Weissbiers, especially Widmer Hefeweizen, Shiner Hefeweizen, and Brookliner Weisse. Our Bavarian Weissbier Standard Refill is going to contain 1 can of Bavarian Weissbier brewing extract. You can see right here. You're also going to get 1 packet of Mr. Beer Bavarian Weissbier yeast. Now you'll notice this packet looks a little bit different than the one that comes with the other refills. We'll go over why here in a minute. You are also going to get 2 bags of Booster. Booster is a product that's completely optional that you can add to your beer that'll give it a bit more alcohol. That's about all it does. It also has a minor effect on body and head retention, but not quite as much as you would get if you added more malts. And as always, with any of our refills or recipes, you're going to be getting a packet of No Rinse Cleanser. That's to sanitize your equipment, which we'll also be going over here in a minute. Just a bit more on the Booster. We get a lot of questions about what exactly is in it. About half of it is maltose, which is the same sort of sugar that you're going to find in malts. It's also got some glucose, also known as dextrose, and it has some dextrins, which are non-fermentable sugars that are going to give it that little bit of boost to the body and the head retention. So, let's get brewing. First, also, before I get too much further with the Booster, another common question we get: do I still need to use priming sugar or carbonation drops if I am adding the Booster in my beer? And the answer is yes, you need to add priming sugar or carbonation drops no matter what goes into the beer. So with that in mind, let's get brewing. The first thing we are going to do is get our can of extract and put it in some hot tap water. Reason being that the stuff inside this can has a real thick, gooey texture, kind of like molasses. If you put it in some hot water, it's going to loosen up and be much easier to pour. So I'm going to go ahead and get that started. Alright, so while that fills up, let's go over some of the equipment you're going to need, in addition to what you're going to get with the refill. You are going to need your fermenter. You are going to need a can opener. You're probably going to need a funnel. You can get by without one, but it's better to have one. It really contains the mess. You're going to need some kind of large spoon or spatula to scrape out the malt extract and to stir it up. And it's nice to have a bowl to sanitize. If you don't have a bowl to sanitize your equipment in, You can just go ahead and sanitize it inside the actual fermenter. The only thing you want to bear in mind is that the fermenter is made of plastic. So if you put something like metal in here, like a metal spoon or a metal whisk, you can scratch it, which can lead to sanitation problems that we will get to here in a moment. First, I'm going to show you how to put together the keg. We call it a keg a lot because it's keg-shaped. That can get a bit confusing, though, because keg can also refer to forced carbonation, which is something completely different, not really good for the beginner stream. So if we say keg or fermenter, we're kind of using those as interchangeable terms here.
Put it together right there, maybe.
So what I like to do is first get the washer on there. Now, you're not going to want to use a wrench or anything to tighten down your spigot because it can break the plastic. You're just going to want to hand tighten it. I like to kind of start with the spigot off at an angle like this, and the reason is that once it starts getting kind of tight, it's tough to get a good grip on the little nut piece in here that I'm tightening down, which can make it difficult to get it tight enough. So once it gets pretty tight like this, you're going to go ahead and hold the nut in place and then turn the spigot the rest of the way. And that way you can kind of get a better grip and get it a little bit tighter. So now that our spigot is, or rather our fermenter is put together, we're going to go ahead and get it sanitized. Alrighty, so the first thing we're going to do is fill that fermenter with about a gallon of water, and we're going to put half the packet of no rinse cleanser in there. I'll go over why once that's done. While it fills up, I'm also looking at the spigot for leaks. I'm especially looking at where the spigot meets the keg around the washer, and I'm looking at where the beer is intended to come out here at the bottom of the spigot. That'll work. Now, what I'm doing now, come over here so you can see, is I'm kind of swirling it around to make it all get mixed in, and then I'm going to walk over to the sink. I'm going to go ahead and turn the fermenter around to make sure that all the surfaces on the inside of the fermenter touch the sanitizing solution. Now, the reason we only used half of the no rinse cleanser is because we're going to use the other half on bottling day, which we'll probably be going over here in the next couple of weeks. Then what I'm going to do is go ahead and grab my bowl, and I'm going to put some of the sanitizing solution in the bowl out of the spigot. Alright, now you may be wondering why we're going through all this trouble of sanitizing. The reason is that beer is a very attractive environment for bacteria, mold, and wild yeast. Now, none of this is going to make you sick, but it can cause the beer to develop off flavors, which obviously we don't want. There's nothing worse than waiting 6 whole weeks for your beer, opening the bottle, and finding out it developed an off flavor in the meantime. Now, I would note that infected batches can happen even to experienced brewers, even when they've sanitized everything correctly. These bacteria are sneaky little guys. So don't take it too hard if you should get an infected batch. Just get in touch with us. We'll be happy to help you figure out what happened and get you set up with the replacements. Now, we have a great blog post on a lot of topics, 7 of them to be specific, about common mistakes that our brewers make, especially first-timers. What I'm doing right now, by the way, is sanitizing everything that's going to be touching the beer here in this sanitizing solution. One of these mistakes we go over in that blog is sanitizing. Improper sanitation is a very common cause of first-time brewer issues. Alright, so we have everything pretty well sanitized. So next I'm going to go ahead and get 4 cups of purified water. We have filtered water here, and put it in our pot here. Now, the reason I'm using purified water and not distilled water is because yeast, being a living thing, needs certain minerals to live, just like we do. So distilled water does not have any of those minerals whatsoever, but tap water, spring water, filtered water all do. So you'll want to steer clear of distilled and reverse osmosis water, but pretty much everything else is okay. I think a lot of brewers kind of fail to consider that most of your beer is going to be made of water, so it's a very important component to give a little bit of thought to. The rule of thumb I usually give out is that if water tastes good to drink by itself, it's going to be good for brewing. Now, just about every time we brew with booster, we're going to go ahead and add it to this water before we heat it up. That is because it mixes more easily with cold water than with hot. If you try and add it once everything's heated up, it'll kind of clump together and you'll have to break it up with a spoon. It's kind of a pain. So with that in mind, we're going to go ahead and add both of our boosters. So we get an ABV of 5% with our finished products. Vindalstick is a Mr.Beer product, Craft Beer 55. That one is actually my recipe. We came out with it a couple weeks ago here. It's got some Equinox hops in it, which give it real nice melon notes. As we're going to go over later in our stream, the German style of wheat beer is typically known for having a pretty minimal hop presence. However, it's been getting a bit more popular in recent years to make them a bit more bitter and add some more interesting hops with American wheat beers. Oh, I got a little splash there. This is why you got to be gentle. Yes, it would help if I pronounced Weissbier correctly, J²2. Thank you for pointing that out. I suppose I was getting a bit lazy there. Let's see. How will you know when the batch is infected? That is an excellent question. Most infections will produce off flavors. A common one would be a sour taste, like vinegar, which is caused by an acetobacter, which is a certain kind of bacteria. Can also have a beer that turns out sour, which can be caused by a lactobacillus infection, another kind of bacteria. Kind of fun fact about all of that, there are styles of beer that many of you may already know about called sour beers, where these bacteria are introduced intentionally because people like the flavor that it produces, and because the sour flavors or kind of funky flavors that you can get can complement some beer styles very well. So I always tell my brewers when they call in, if you get a batch you think is infected, don't throw it out right away because it might not necessarily be a bad thing. It's also worth noting that infections can take weeks to months to show up in your beer.
Josh says use the whisk.
Use the whisk. Thank you, Josh. Man, this must have been hurting you guys to watch. Opening day jitters, what can I say? Okay, so now that our booster is just about mixed in, I'm going to go ahead and bring our water to a boil. I'm sure Josh has pointed out by now, you're not going to want to actually boil the HME, the hop to malt extract, the stuff in the can, because it already has the bittering hops added. So if you boil it, it can give you grassy off flavors. Yes, to be a real brew guy is absolutely required to have a beard. It doesn't have to be a good one. It just has to be there. Let's see, what else do we got here? Alright. Good enough for my purposes. So, while we wait for that to get started, I'm going to go ahead and get my can of extract ready. I like to go ahead and peel off the label before I start opening the can. Reason being that every now and again you'll get a little piece of label drop off and end up in your wort. Wort is what we call all this stuff once we mix it together, but before it turns into beer. And like we were just talking about, any foreign object getting into your beer that hasn't been sanitized is going to increase the likelihood of you're getting an infected batch. I use regular. You know, Craft Beer 55, I've gotten some similar feedback. Some people like having a lot of foam, and as we're going to get into a bit later, this style in particular is supposed to be highly carbonated, so you can increase or decrease the amount of carbonation in your beer by increasing or decreasing the amount of priming sugar or carbonation drops that you put in. But it's not a real exact science. You kind of just have to guess and dial it in. I usually suggest that if you're trying to figure out, you know that you want to change your carbonation, but you're not sure exactly what you want to do yet, I suggest making a batch and doing 2 bottles each with a different level of carbonation, going 1/8 of a teaspoon each way, and marking them. And that should give you a pretty wide variety to take a look at. As Josh notes, there is no difference between the sugar and the carb drops. I would say, I think bottling day is a little bit quicker as long as you're using whole carbonation drops. I do admit they can be kind of a pain to cut up, but if you have a pill cutter or something like that on hand, it does become a bit easier. Now we wait. I think this is probably our best refill of our standard series of refills, but I'm partial to wheat beers. They were kind of the first beer that showed me that there are craft beers other than IPAs. I'm not personally a big fan of the super bitter West Coast IPAs that are kind of synonymous with craft beer in popular imagination. And a lot of the times when you go to a grocery store or something like that, that's what they'll have in their craft beer collection. So this was kind of where I found there was something different with beer. how much time do you suggest between brewing and drinking? Pocket Junior, I promise if you can give me like 5 minutes to get through the actual brewing, we're going to talk about that here in a minute. It's something that you're going to find you get conflicting advice on. Nothing about brewing is set in stone. We recommend 3 full weeks in the fermenter because that's how we've gotten best results. We find it gives a lower chances of off flavors. I think conventional wisdom in brewing has been for a long time that if you leave your beer on the sediment for more than 10 to 14 days, you can get off flavors, but we find it takes more like up to 4 weeks. So with that in mind, we don't bother racking to a secondary or anything like that. In our kits, we just keep it in the one fermenter for 3 full weeks. If you are doing a beer that's got any kind of extra ingredients like hops or fruit, spices, anything like that, this is usually a good time to get them ready. Unfortunately, since we're doing the standard refill, it's kind of a waiting game this time. Flops, oh my goodness, I have had many flops too. Those of us that do this for a living and are making beer all the time, we have batches all the time that don't turn out the way we'd hope. Just last month, I had a batch of cider that I was going to mix in with a mead to make a cider that got infected. And I do this all day. So, like I said, don't take it too hard if you have a batch that doesn't come out too well. And I also highly encourage you, should that ever happen, to go ahead and give us a call. We're happy to help you figure out what went wrong. If there's a way to fix it, we're happy to help you get it fixed. And if your beer just straight up needs replacing, that's something we can do too in that event. Oh, it's so close, yet it's so far. Now, one thing that's kind of nice about brewing wheat beers is that you don't have to watch the temperature quite as closely as you do with a lot of other ale yeasts for reasons we'll get into here in a minute. So these are beer style along with saisons that I typically recommend to brewers who are looking for something to brew in the summertime, especially those of us who live in places like Tucson, Arizona with the merciless sun. Helping you out has never had a bad batch. That means you haven't been brewing enough, man. If you brew enough beer, you'll have one eventually. Trust me. I'm jealous, though. Alright, so we can go ahead and call that boiling. So I'm going to go ahead and turn off the heat. Since we're using this induction stove, do we keep it on the stove for porn purposes? Should have worked that out first. I like to take the beer off of our burner, or rather the pot off our burner, because I have spent many, many hours scraping dried, burnt malt extract off this little thing from spilling all over the place, so I like to save myself a little trouble. Thanks. You see, I'm learning with you guys. Alright, so we're going to go ahead and pour our hopped malt extract into our hot water. This is the base of the Whittier Whistle, which is an excellent beer. Wit beers are actually a Belgian wheat beer style. Today we're focusing more on the German styles. They are similar but not the same. So you'll note that I'm being real careful to get every last drop of this extract out of the can. The reason is, the more extract you leave in the can, the more ABV, body, color, and flavor that you're losing. You want to avoid that. Black Moon Weissen is a good one too. Yeah, I don't enjoy this part either. It's a total pain, right? And it takes forever. But I would note that as far as brewing pains in the neck go, this is pretty light. If you were gonna try and brew from scratch, which is a perfectly good way to make beer, and we all do that too, it takes a lot longer. You need a lot more space, and while the ingredients are often a bit less expensive, the startup cost for the equipment and everything you need tends to be more expensive. You also usually have to do it outside, which is not always convenient. Alright, that looks pretty well done. So I'm just going to slowly stir it up a bit, because since the extract is so heavy, it can kind of settle to the bottom a bit. We don't want any sticking. Okay. So now I'm going to run and get our sanitized fermenter. Okay. Oh my goodness, I almost forgot to sanitize my funnel. Fortunately for us, we have a slightly faster product on hand for sanitizing. There are any number of products you can use to sanitize your equipment. We use the no rinse cleanser a lot because, as you might imagine, we have a little bit on hand. But we also use Star San, which is nice because you can store it in a spray bottle like that, and it's a little bit quicker. We do offer Star San for sale up on our website. Alright. So now that I got my works all mixed up, I'm going to go ahead and fill my fermenter to the #1 or 4-quart line with cold water. Now, the reason you want to use cold water is because you're going to want your wort to be at about 65 degrees Fahrenheit when you pitch your yeast. If it's too much warmer than that, you're going to get an off flavor that's kind of cidery. It's caused by a chemical called acetaldehyde. We'll go into that a bit later. But it gives the beer kind of an unpleasant apple cider sort of taste that does not mesh well at all with the kind of style we're going for. So now that we're full up to the #1 line, I'm going to go ahead and pour my worts into my fermenter. Once our wort is in, we are going to go ahead and add our 2nd gallon of cold water. Oh, we don't have Star San on sale at the site. That's my mistake. If you ever find yourself in Tucson, we do carry it at our Everything Homebrew store. I'm looking back here at our #2 line because I don't want to end up with watered down beer. Alright. What I'm going to do now is aerate my wort, which means I'm going to stir it real quick with the whisk for a couple seconds here. That's going to go ahead and get some oxygen in there. Just like yeast needs minerals to stay alive and do its thing, it also needs oxygen. Now, after you've pitched your yeast and the beer is brewing, and then once it's brewed, you're going to want to absolutely minimize its exposure to oxygen, because oxidized beer has an off flavor that tastes like wet cardboard, and that is something we are trying to avoid. that should be more than enough. We're doing a pretty small batch here. Now I'm going to go ahead, open my yeast, and sprinkle it in. This is called pitching the yeast. Brewers love their vocabulary. So, once our yeast is pitched, we are going to go ahead and put on our lid, which again should have been sanitized. I thought I knew what I was doing. And we are going to close our fermenter. Now, once that lid is on, you shouldn't take it off unless you have to, which is also outlined in that great blog post. Now, there are going to be some circumstances under which you have to take it off. For example, if you're going to dry hop, if you're going to do a late addition with some spice or fruit or something like that, it's going to have to come off. But when that happens, you're going to want to be real quick. You're only going to want to have it off just as long as necessary to get your ingredients in. Okay, so with this beer, unlike most of our standard refills, which you're going to want to keep at a temperature range between 65 and 75 degrees, this one can go up into about 80 Fahrenheit. Now, you're going to want to keep in mind that's the temperature of the wort, not the temperature of the air in the room. The wort is going to be a little bit warmer than the air around it in most cases because fermentation produces a little bit of heat. So if your beer is in a room that's 75, the beer itself might be more like 78, which can lead to off flavors, usually. Like I said, not in this case. Weissbiers use a special kind of top fermenting ale yeast that is not quite as clean finishing as the sort of yeast you would find in a pale ale or an IPA. It produces some compounds called phenols and esters, which give German Weissbiers their distinctive banana or clove notes that you will notice if you ever get your hands on one. So, we're going to keep this beer between 65 and 80 degrees Fahrenheit, which again is a bit higher than normal. If you let your fermentation temperature get too high, you can end up with that same acetaldehyde off flavor that I went over earlier. The same problem you can have when you pitch your yeast when the wort is too warm. You're going to want to keep it out of direct sunlight. Light bulbs are okay. The reason you want to keep it out of sunlight is because UV light, ultraviolet light, is actually what skunks beer, not heat, as many people think. That's the reason that the fermenter is amber instead of clear like our cider fermenter. You can brew beer in clear fermenters. You're just going to want to make sure to keep it out of sunlight. Now, after your beer has been setting for about 24 hours, you're going to start to see what's called Crowson forming on the top, which is just foam. It can be white, brown, grayish, have flecks in it. It can be kind of clear looking, kind of opaque looking. There can be a lot, there can be a little, there can be a lot at the beginning and then it kind of tapers off. There can be a lot the whole time. A lot of brewers are under the impression that the amount of foam in the fermenter relates to how well the beer is fermenting. This is not the case. Just because you don't see foam doesn't mean it's not fermenting. A better indication of whether the beer is fermenting is whether there's trub collecting on the bottom. Trub is sediment. If you've ever made any batches before, you probably noticed some kind of goopy stuff there on the bottom of the fermenter. It's just made of spent yeast and malt particles. Not bad for you or anything. It just kind of tastes yeasty if you get a mouthful of it, so we're looking to minimize the amount that ends up in your bottles, which we'll go over later. You're going to want to ferment for 21 days total. As I mentioned, this is an area where we differ from a lot of home brewing convention. Our blog about common mistakes is going to point out a very common mistake is kind of getting yourself confused by going to a whole bunch of different sources for advice. Advice in and of itself is a good thing, but like I said, nothing about brewing is carved into stone, and if you ask 5 brewers, the same question, you might get 5 completely different answers. And none of them might necessarily be any more wrong than the others. There's a lot of different ways to do this. A lot of it kind of just depends on what kind of beer you want to end up with and what you just personally like doing. But for beginners, such as the brewers this stream is intended for, I recommend going by our instructions at least at first. And then once you kind of get an idea of how we intend it to come out, then that's a great time to start experimenting, switching it up, and seeing what other people's advice does to your beer. That blog post is also going to point out another very common mistake: rushing. A lot of people see 3 weeks, that's forever, and this other guy says 7 days. I want my beer 2 weeks sooner, so I'm going to follow the advice that sounds better. That's not always the best course of action. I really recommend going by the guidelines at least the first couple times and then experimenting. All right. So now that our beer is brewed, we'd like to talk a little bit just about German wheat beers in general. German wheat beers, which are also known as Weissbiers, are pale straw to gold in color. They're top fermenting beers, ales, like we said, traditionally brewed with yeast that produces phenols, which give the beer their clove notes, and esters, which give the beer their banana notes in this case. Not every phenol tastes like cloves, not every ester tastes like bananas, but the kind that show up in wheat beers do. Now, something to bear in mind with wheat yeast specifically is that if you brew on the warmer side of the temperature spectrum, you'll tend to end up more with the esters, with the banana nuts. If you ferment on the cooler side of the spectrum, you'll tend to end up with more phenols, clove notes. A lot of brewers don't like wheat beers because they think they all taste like banana bombs. This is not the case. It kind of depends on how you brew it. They're pretty moderate strength beers, the typical Weissbier. We'll get into some variations that have some higher ABVs, but most of them are going to be in the 5% range by the BJCP standards. The BJCP being the governing body that kind of has the final say on what constitutes what beer style. Weissbiers are a pale, refreshing beer with high carbonation, like I said, a dry finish, what's described as a fluffy mouthfeel, and that distinctive yeast character. In terms of balance, this is a malty beer. The wheat is kind of the star of the show along with the yeast. It's going to have a very low hop character. Our Weissbier actually has an IBU of 19, but the most current BJCP standards allow for an IBU of no more than 15. So we're kind of cheating, I guess, but it's pretty close. It's not going to have a lot of aroma hops in the German style. The aroma is going to be all that yeast. All right. It is typically served with suspended yeast in it, which gives it that cloudy appearance. There is a clear variation called a Crystalweisen, which doesn't have that in it. It's a clear wheat beer. Going back to our blog post, we do not recommend filtering any beer because the filtering process can lead to oxygen exposure and infection, which, as we've discussed already, are bad things. Instead, what we recommend to clarify your beer is called cold crashing, which means you put the whole fermenter in the fridge for, I do 48 hours, some people do 1 day, and that makes all that settlement kind of settle to the bottom and become compact. As we note in our instructions, the cloudiness of the beer can, in some circumstances, be an indicator of how close the beer is to being done. Yeast does what is called flocculating, which means as the brewing process goes on, the yeast is kind of going to start to clump together and fall out to the bottom of your beer, which is where you get the trub. So if you have a beer style that's supposed to be clear, like say an IPA or a pale ale, and you're at the 3-week mark and you notice and it's still pretty cloudy, it might not be a bad idea to cold crash it, or at least give it another couple days, maybe a week in the fermenter. We can go up to 4 weeks in our fermenter without seeing off flavors. But I would also note there are some styles of beer like this one that are supposed to be cloudy. You can leave this in the fermenter for 2 months, and when you come back, it'll still be cloudy. It's supposed to be like that. So don't wait for this one to clear out, but with other styles that are supposed to be clear, like I said, cold crashing or just time typically solves the problem. Time typically solves most brewing problems. This is one of the rare beer styles that does not age very well. The reason for that is those esters and phenols that we discussed are very volatile chemicals. They tend to dissipate very quickly, just like hop oils, which means that IPAs and wheat beers are both two beers you don't want to condition too long. You're going to want to go ahead and drink these while they're fresh. Like I said, it's supposed to be real well carbonated. It's supposed to be kind of have a spritzy finish with high to very high carbonation. It's described as effervescent. An interesting note is that the perception of sweetness with this beer does not actually come from a high finishing gravity. It's actually a dry finishing beer. So finishing gravity refers to how much fermentable sugar the yeast leaves in the beer after it's done. If the yeast leaves a whole bunch of sugar in there, the beer's going to taste sweeter. If it doesn't, it's going to taste drier, which is kind of the opposite of sweet. So one would think that wheat beers would have a high finishing gravity because they're a bit sweet, but that actually comes from the low IBUs, from the low hop presence. So you're not so much tasting sugar as much as you're tasting the absence of hops. The little fermentable sugar that's left stands out a lot more. That's what we've just been talking about is called attenuation. Attenuation is how much of the available fermentable sugar in your wort that the beer will eat up. A high attenuator will leave a very dry beer. A low attenuator will leave a very sweet beer. Like I said, the hop character is low to none. In this style, you're typically going to use, if you were to add hops, a German strain like Hallertau. It's medium light to medium heavy body, so kind of in the middle, not too light, not too thick. But the suspended yeast can make it feel more full-bodied than it is. So it's interesting. I guess it's kind of a deceptive beer. It seems sweet, but not because it is, and it seems full-bodied, but compared to other beers, it's actually not. If you were making this from scratch, about 50 to 70% of your grist, your grain bill, all the malt you're going to use should be made of wheat. Usually in most beers, it's going to be malted barley, but in Weiss beers or wheat beers, obviously, it's going to have more malted wheat. All right. There are a number of variations on the Weiss beer. We already went over the Crystal Weizen, which is a clear variation that doesn't have the suspended yeast. There is also a variation called the Weizenbock, which is kind of similar in body, color, and ABV to a Doppelbock, but it is a wheat beer. There is also a Dunkles Weissbier, which is a darker Weissbier that has some caramel notes you'll get from the slightly roasted malts. This is a very, very old style, hundreds of years old. It was initially reserved for Bavarian royalty. The modern variety originated with Schneider Brewery in Munich in 1872. Fun fact, during World War II, Schneider Brewery had to evacuate from Munich, and during the occupation, they were one of the only breweries in Germany that was allowed to continue brewing beer, and they sent their traditional style back to Munich, and they were allowed to brew on the understanding they were going to make a low ABV beer that was reserved exclusively for soldiers. So if you wanted a beer, gotta work for it, I guess. Alright, so that just about covers the style and history. I really like wheat beers, in addition to just not, the kind of nostalgia I get for my first craft beer. They're also really versatile. You can do a lot with them. They're great for fruit beers. I know it's kind of an unpopular opinion, but I'm a huge fan of fruit beers, and I think this is one of the best bases for them. You can also use it to kind of showcase some hops. Like I said, there's an American variety that's gaining more popularity. Modern Times has a really good one that uses more tropical or fruity hops that you might find in an IPA, in a wheat beer, but without the bitterness. So that's kind of catched on as well. Like I said, fruit beers, spiced beers. All right. So I think that about covers what I was hoping to go over. Were there any questions from the peanut gallery? I'll go ahead and give it a second to let you type, everybody. Can we add oats in the wort before fermenting? I think what you're referring to, Shadeo-san, is called a partial mash recipe, where you incorporate grains into an extract beer. That's probably going to be a topic more for intermediate streams. This one's geared a little bit more towards beginners. So on Tuesdays, when it's with me, we're probably going to be sticking more to the extract beers. I would also note, just with your terminology, you refer to oats. Oats are a very specific kind of grain that are only used in certain styles, like oatmeal stouts. So if you're referring to kind of just that grainy looking stuff that you put into your beer, you're usually going to call it malt. You're only going to call it oats if you're referring specifically to oats, as Mr. Beer Josh kind of just went over. Were there any other questions today, guys? Thank you guys so much for joining us. It's been great brewing for you. I would also just like to mention we are now a Twitch affiliate, so you can subscribe and you can cheer on our channel now, and any funds raised will go to the Humane Society, which is obviously a very good cause. So I think that about wraps it up. Thank you so much for watching, and you can tune in tomorrow when Josh will be back to walk us through how to brew entirely with unhopped malt extract doing a hop boil.